and welcome to the Daily Pilgrim channel and what is the first of a series of nostalgia videos. My journey, of which I've documented and recorded various bits and pieces, the last 18 months I have been doing a podcast. Now that podcast is no more. I've pulled the plug on it, and all of the infrastructure on the podcast hosting platform and all of the recordings that were everywhere, they've all been taken down. Simply because I was paying, not a huge amount, it was £12 a month, but it sort of adds up with other things as well. And I had run out of things to say. When I started, and I built this, which was about 2 years ago that I built it, and I'd started off for 6 months recording an audiobook. Now, this audiobook was through Audible, and it was probably the worst book in the entire world to try and do an audio version of. It was a bird-watching book full of illustrations. Somebody had asked me to read this book, and there were several problems. The first of which was it was full of illustrations. There was no way I could actually record what I was seeing without reauthoring the book. So, there's a bird here and it looks a bit like this and a bit like that. The feathers do this. You couldn't describe that over audio without reauthoring this person's book. And I highlighted this to the author, and he said, "No, do whatever." So I spent months of work, and sadly the author then decided he didn't want me to do it anymore, and I didn't get anything at all. I had dedicated all this time and effort. The other problem, of course, was that a lot of these bird names, whilst bird watchers know how to pronounce all these names, the Latin terms and what have you, I didn't. So I had to try and learn them, and I'm sure I made a few mistakes along the way. But I had this recording studio left. It had cost me hundreds of pounds to build this. And the various microphones and other bits and pieces of recording equipment and what have you. And it was just stood there, or sat there, doing nothing. So I decided to create a podcast, and this was going to be part of my journey, and I was going to do the weekly recordings of, hello, and this is what's happening on the Daily Pilgrim podcast this week. There was the constant ongoing joke that I was running out of oxygen, because with all this sound deadening tiles and the lining on the door as well, there wasn't a lot of oxygen that actually got in the room. So you almost had to sort of take a big deep breath and open the door. So when you're ready to start recording, you'd shut the door and then press record. And then you had about 20 minutes of useful breathing time before it started to get very, very stuffy. So the joke every week was, I'm running out of oxygen. It amused me. So this is the first of those nostalgia episodes that I'm going to just put on YouTube now. When I did the podcast, it was audio only. As I said, I was paying on a separate podcast hosting platform for it. I haven't put it on YouTube up until now, although I think episode 4 is. But I'm going to put them all on here. The podcast has gone, but I thought for nostalgia, certain people had followed my journey. Certain people took inspiration from it, and that was absolutely wonderful when people contacted me and said, "Oh, I've listened to this episode, and it's made a real difference," And for me, that was an important step. So I wanted to preserve it. I thought I'd put them on here one a week. I'm going to upload them. There's not a full 18 months worth. It was over the span of 18 months, but I think there's sort of 30-something episodes in total. The honest truth is, I started to run out of things to say. Doing YouTube videos when you sort of feel like it, or you get inspired, or you've got something you want to do or say, and you go out and you create it, and you come back and you sort of do the post-production, and then you publish it. That doesn't have a particular time scale. But when you're trying to do a podcast regularly every single week, you have to think of something to say. Now, I had a little notebook, and I used to write the notes and what have you. The first 3 podcasts, the first 3 episodes, they sort of come together in a little cluster, because the first one, Journey Begins, which is coming up in a minute, I recorded that uploaded it, and then I'd gone out in the camper van to do an adventure. It was the adventure where I went to Wales. Now, sadly, a lot of that footage didn't really make it into a video as such. There were some lovely bits, some lovely clips that I sort of took, and the first drone flight was on there as well. So the first podcast had been uploaded. The second podcast was recorded on the road, so there was no introduction music or what have you. I recorded it on the road whilst doing that adventure in Wales. And then the third one sort of reflected on the time that I had in Wales. So those three, they were a very, very important start to the journey. You must listen to them sort of as one complete, particularly the bit about me nearly defecating myself whilst running up a mountain. Again, it amused me. So this is the first of the 30-something episodes, whatever it is. So I'm going to release one a week. There'll be a little intro like this, probably not as long as this one. This is the first one. So this is where the journey begins. Enjoy. Hello and greetings. My name's Alex, and I would like to welcome you to the Daily Pilgrim podcast. Now, if you have a moment, may I invite you to check out dailypilgrim.com, the website, where you will find details of the YouTube channel, the other social media, bits and pieces, how to get involved, how to, get in touch and hopefully support. That'd be lovely. This is the inaugural and first episode, so we're going to start with a bit of a backstory in a minute, but a little bit about what's to come. Essentially, I'm on a bit of a journey. Quite a monumental one, really. And I'd like you to come along for the ride. It is, yes, it's a journey of life. There have been lows, and hopefully there'll be highs. Good and bad, and an adventure along the way. It starts with a breakup, yes, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Essentially, I was forced to reinvent myself. Everything on this channel, this podcast, the YouTube, everything, all of that, everything is about making the best life that you possibly can for yourself. Because I hate to break it to you, you only get one life. It's not a rehearsal, no more cliches, I promise, but it is right here and right now. And so, without further ado, let's start the first episode with that backstory. Now, I want to make a backstory such as this as exciting as I possibly can. So I'm going to do it in an animated voice. And I'm going to do it in such a way that, I'm going to pretend that there was no hurt whatsoever. 2.5 years ago, my wife of 23 years decided she didn't want to continue down that road. And that was fine. I told my friend Ben at the time, and I said, it's okay, I've worked through it in my mind. I've now reached a point where I know I feel good about it. It's a positive thing, and good for her. All right, that may be what I said to him, but he did turn around and tell me to stop talking complete nonsense. The honest truth was that we often, when we're broken and we're hurting or we have absolutely no choice, it is then that we often make those decisions that change our lives. For me, this was the biggie. You see, I define myself as being half of a whole. I was half of the Alex and Gemma relationship. I wasn't me on my own. I was exactly half of a couple. Now, when I no longer have the option to be half a couple, you would think, you're still half. But actually, no, you become a very broken shell. Maybe that's just me, but I was an absolutely broken shell. And people said, you've hit the bottom of the pit now, but at least there's only one way to go. I really wanted to throttle those people, because believe me, when you're at the bottom of the pit, and as you see it, the world is literally caving in above you, what do? You shout up and you ask for a pneumatic drill because you haven't dug enough. You do and say some really stupid things that stay with you for your lifetime, and even if they don't have a negative impact on friends or relationships or other things other than your relationship that has broken down, they do stay with you as scars. I often say to myself, did I really do that? Did I really say that? Did I really believe that was going to be a good thing when I made
whatever that decision was? Well, I have made some bad decisions. I've made some good ones too. And the important thing is, when you're recreating yourself, as we'll get to in a moment, when you're recreating yourself, you have to take risks. You have to take chances, because if you don't, you'll never do anything. Yes, you'll be nice and safe and secure in your bed, but you'll never do anything. You'll never strive for, new levels, to break new boundaries, to be a new person. Keep doing what you've always done and you'll keep getting what you've always had. Now, I'm not a huge one for cliches, but I do agree with that one. The honest truth was, I had no choice. I was forced to leave the home that I had made for myself, and I was basically homeless for 6 months. Now, I say that I was homeless, and indeed I was. Legally speaking, I had nowhere that I had the right to reside, but I did stay with my parents for part of that. Now, I think they will admit, like me, that whilst it was extremely kind and very, very nice of them, it probably wasn't what I needed 100%. I needed to be on my own to work through a lot of these things. So I really only started grieving about 6 months afterwards. After I'd done this, I think I very quickly realised that, life wasn't what I wanted it to be. I started off with wishing I could go back to how things were, and practically begged, well, no, not practically, I really did, beg my ex to take me back. Now, she didn't, and at the time, I thought she was a bit of a cow for this. However, in retrospect, she was probably a very, very sensible person for this. You see, if you try and go back, it's never quite the same. I don't think anyway, and it never really works. I will also just say that, the breakup was her decision. She called something. At the time, she called it, and I thought she was the worst person in the world. Actually, now I do look and I think, well, maybe she was a lot braver than me. She called what I couldn't. But the purpose of this podcast, YouTube channel and everything, isn't just to share my life in a sort of a what an experience I've had and what a lot I've learnt from it way. I do hope, in all seriousness, that the things I've been through might save some other people some pain and some hurt. I do also think that maybe there are some lessons to be learned and maybe it's useful to people. Partly, I wanted to do it for the sheer entertainment value. Partly because I love the sound of my own voice and I now get to do that in earphones. But in particular, and not just because I built this sound recording studio in the cupboard under the stairs, but because I wanted to do something different. I wanted to recreate my life. I did really, really want to change things and make an impact for the better. And there were so many things that I've been trying to say and do for years, and I thought a podcast was an absolutely wonderful outlet and a way forward. So that's a very, very personal look into my psyche. Well, I say that, it's really just a statement, isn't it? But it does come very seriously from a very, very personal place. I wanted to do something. I wanted to make a difference. So that's where we're at, and this is how we begin the podcast. So let me tell you about the journey that I had yesterday. Now, this is, I'm afraid to say, how a lot of these podcasts are going to go, and I've lots planned, believe me. A funny thing happened to me on my way here. I think that's going to be my catchphrase. I set out because I wanted to make a YouTube video. Now, I know this is a podcast, but bear with me. I went and I took all of my camera equipment, and I've invested quite heavily in my camera equipment, I will be honest. I put it in the boot of the car. I made sure I had all the charging wires. I set the GoPros up in the car itself so that I could record the journey and have a little bit of a natter as I was going off to do things. I had planned, and I looked on the map, to go to Cowleys Woodland Park, which is sort of on the boundary of Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. It was about 20 miles away from where I'm based. So I thought, that's fine, 20 miles, about 40 minutes, something like that. I will pack myself a nice lunch, which I did, and I really, really did. It was a really, really nice lunch I packed. I then set off in the car, armed with all the camera equipment, and I went in the direction of the place. Now, a few things happened on the journey. First of all, I had to make a stop on the way and drop off a school bag for my partner's son, which I duly did. So I then realised that I was facing the wrong direction on the sat-nav. No problem, I thought. I'll go down this road and then I will just, the sat-nav will rework it out and it'll be fine. Now, the thing that you don't know, because I haven't told you yet, is very recently I was forced to change my vehicle. Sadly, the MX-5, which I'd bought, developed a bit of a fault, and so I purchased a Ford Ka, the street car version, the convertible. Now, I thought the MX-5 was low to the ground with zero clearance. Believe me, you could build a house underneath the MX-5 by comparison to what the street car does. Also, the road I was on was very bumpy, and so I nearly took the bottom of the car out down this tiny little rural country lane. And then the last part, it was a dead end, wasn't it? So I had to turn this thing round. Oh, and the lock on the car is absolutely naff for such a little car. You could turn a Land Rover easier than you could turn this thing. So I turned it round, and all the bashing of the bottom of the car, which I'd just done, all over again I had to do on the way back up the hill. I then picked up the road in the correct direction, and off I headed. I got to a left-hand turning and went, brilliant, we're there, and off I turned to the left, not realising I'd just turned into somebody's private drive. I hadn't, in fact, gone onto the A40 dual carriageway, but instead onto some farmer's drive. How I made this mistake, I've no idea, but believe me, compared to the way the rest of the day went, this was actually quite successful. I managed to turn around without too much effort, again banging the bottom of the car off, and it was at this point I realised I was quite hungry. So I went to the boot of the car and went to get my lunch out. That's odd, I thought to myself. I know I packed it. I didn't put it in the boot. It must be in the front. So I went to the front of the car, and it wasn't there either. Now, when I returned home many hours later, I found what was left of the packed lunch. Very kindly, my partner's dogs had decided that they didn't want it to go to waste, and with all those meat products, if it had just been allowed to sit on the dining room table, it would have in time gone bad. The heat would have changed certain properties within the meal, and it would have gone bad. In fact, even I could have had food poisoning from bacteria build-up and growth. The dogs really saved me, and they really helped me. Not only did they eat the entire contents of the packed lunch, but they chewed up the wrappers and left them dispensed all over the floor so that I could see their kind work. Effectively, not able to write or communicate by speaking, they had presented to me clear evidence that actually the problem had been solved. Not only did I not have to worry about the food being wasted and going off, but I didn't need to worry about the potential of food poisoning should I pick it up by accident. Very, very kind of them, I thought. But returning back to the journey, I then continued on my way. I found the right road, got lost a little bit more, went in the direction of a shop, realised that there weren't any shops for miles, and then I tried to look on Google Maps. There was no signal, of course, drove round getting lost a little bit more, and then I found a shop. Well, it wasn't a shop so much, it was more someone that had opened their living room, having put a sort of a branded sign above the door, and they didn't actually really sell anything particularly nice. So I loaded up with chocolate and all sorts of other bits and pieces to keep me going, and an out-of-date pasty. All right, it wasn't out of date, but it was virtually out of date. It was reduced to £1. So I then got back in the car, triumphant with my snacks, and set off in the direction that I was originally going in. I managed to follow the sat-nav, which did have a signal at this point, and I found where I'd been looking for. A beautiful bluebell wood, and I went and set up the camera. I then spent about half an hour talking to the camera, and, I'd taken a bit of time first. I'd sort of set it up and, check that I was in the shot and that sort of thing. I then started recording, and somebody came along, started talking to me. I had to pause what I was doing, But I left it rolling, and I then carried on, and I had people watching me. I was getting animated and excited, and I had an audience. It was brilliant. I got to the end and went back to the camera, triumphant, to realise, yes, you'd guessed it, that I hadn't pressed record. An hour of my life, not only that I will never ever get back, but that I will always curse myself, because I'm sure the video was so absolutely blasted perfect that I could have put it straight up on YouTube without even editing it. All right, that's probably not the case, but you know what? It's how I'm going to remember it. I then decided I'd give it another go, but before I could, the snow, the hail, and the rain came down. That was nice in May, wasn't it? So I went back to the car, shoving the camera stuff in the boot, and then set off in the direction of home, completely defeated with what was, let's be honest, a bit of a crappy day. When I was speaking to my partner later on that evening, and I said to her, I went to this lovely Bluebell Wood, as it was only 20 miles away, and she said, oh, did you not go to the one that's 1.5 miles up the road? And I thought, oh no. I've literally wasted 40 minutes each way with all of that and all the problems of food and everything else, and there was actually somewhere I could have filmed 1.5 minutes up the road. So, that was yesterday. That was yesterday's journey. But today is much more exciting, because I decided I would sit down and do this podcast, and I would share some of the wonderful stories and bits and pieces with you. Now, I did promise that I'd talk about life's journey, or if I didn't promise, I am now. You see, I was forced, as I mentioned earlier, to recreate my life, to completely redefine who I was and what I wanted to do. I was very determined in those early stages that I wanted to go to a hotel somewhere and sit down in the bar. Very calmly, I would sit down with a very expensive leather folder and perhaps a Mont Blanc pen. I would then make a list of all the things I wanted to do. I would then create a plan of next action steps and all of that sort of good stuff, and I would completely redefine and recreate my life. Now, I never went on that trip. I never went and sat in the hotel bar, and I never had the malt scotches or anything else whilst I was doing it. The honest truth is that it took me a very, very long time of struggling and pulling things together before actually really I had a clear idea of what I wanted to do. But I do now, and part of that is this podcast. So with that very clear indication and very sort of clear idea of what I'm planning to do, I hope that although the backstory and the ancillary bits and pieces were a little bit, well, not boring, but they weren't quite as exciting as I would have liked, I do hope that the story of yesterday can give you a rough idea, the funny thing that happened to me, of what's likely to come on the following podcasts. So as we come to the end of this very first episode, I would just like to say thank you indeed for joining and being part of things. I do really hope that you will come back and join in for more episodes. There's a lot more to come, lots more journeys to undertake, and hopefully lots more entertainment to come your way. Now, this was recorded in a cupboard underneath the stairs, admittedly one that I did kit out as a sound recording studio, but it is nonetheless a cupboard under the stairs. It's important I mention this because what's about to happen may shock you. Yes, the applause. Now, I'd like to say that this was recorded in front of a live studio audience, but as you probably guessed by now, that would be a lie. So, what you can hear is the recorded applause that came very kindly with the PodTrack machine thingy that I bought. The band that you can hear playing is not in the corner, it's also in the machine, so it is technically in the corner. But I will say thank you very much indeed for being part of this very first episode. It may not have made 100% sense, and it may not be completely what future episodes are going to be like, but thank you nonetheless. Do remember, go to dailypilgrim.com. There's all the information and bits and pieces and how to follow and, you know, all those subscribey things. Oh, and Patreon. Don't forget Patreon. That'd be very, very helpful. So, I will say thank you very much indeed once again. And finally, good night.